August 7, 1942, and the USS Macaulay cut through dark Pacific waters toward an island that most Americans had never heard of before, a place called Guadalcanal that would become synonymous with some of the most brutal fighting of World War II and would test the limits of human endurance in ways that nobody boarding these transport ships could possibly imagine. Sergeant William Carter stood on the crowded deck watching the island emerge from the morning mist like some prehistoric monster, its volcanic mountains covered in dense jungle that looked impenetrable from this distance, and he tried to control the fear that was making his hands shake despite his best efforts to project the calm confidence that his squad expected from their NCO. August 7, 1942. The USS Macaulay cut through dark Pacific waters toward Guadalcanal. Sergeant William Carter stood on deck watching the island emerge from morning mist. Dense jungle covering volcanic mountains. It looked peaceful. Beautiful even. But Carter knew better. This island would become hell on earth for the next 6 months. Carter was 26 years old, a squad leader in the 1st Marine Division who had never been in combat before despite months of training that had prepared him for every aspect of warfare except the psychological reality of knowing that within a few hours he would be shooting at other human beings who would be trying their best to kill him in return. Around him stood 11,000 Marines who were about to participate in America's first major offensive operation of the war, most of them teenagers fresh from training camps scattered across the United States, farm boys and city kids who had enlisted after Pearl Harbor fired by patriotic fervor that hadn't yet been tempered by the reality of combat that strips away all illusions about the glory of war. Carter was 26 years old. 1st Marine Division. A veteran of training camps but never combat. Around him, 11,000 Marines prepared for America's first major offensive of the war. Most were teenagers. Kids from farms and cities who'd enlisted after Pearl Harbor. They had no idea what jungle warfare meant. Neither did Carter. They'd learned together. Corporal Jack Martinez from Los Angeles was checking his rifle for what must have been the 20th time that morning, a nervous habit that betrayed his anxiety even though his face remained impassive and showed none of the fear that Carter knew must be churning in his gut. Martinez was 20 years old, a high school football star who had joined the Marines with 3 of his best friends because they wanted to serve together and thought the war would be over quickly enough that they could all come home as heroes. And Carter hoped that optimism wouldn't get them all killed before they learned how to survive in combat. Corporal Jack Martinez from Los Angeles checked his rifle for the 100th time. 20 years old. High school football star. Joined the Marines with his 3 best friends. All 4 were in Carter's squad. Private Tommy Wilson from Alabama. Private Joe Chin from San Francisco. Private Eddie O'Brien from Boston. Young men about to face something beyond imagination. Private Tommy Wilson from Alabama was standing nearby, his rifle slung over his shoulder while he stared at the island with eyes that seemed too young to be heading into battle. And Carter made a mental note to keep a close watch on Wilson because the kid seemed fragile in a way that suggested he might break under the stress of combat. Next to Wilson stood Private Joe Chin from San Francisco, whose family had been sent to an internment camp even though they were American citizens, but Joe had volunteered anyway because he wanted to prove his loyalty to a country that treated people who looked like him with suspicion and hostility. And Carter respected that kind of determination even if he didn't entirely understand it. The landing was unopposed. Marines hit the beaches expecting fierce resistance. Found nothing. The Japanese construction workers had fled into the jungle. By afternoon, Marines controlled the half-finished airfield. Intelligence called it Henderson Field. That airfield would become the key to everything. Whoever controlled it controlled the Solomon Islands. Controlled the sea lanes to Australia. Controlled the Pacific War. The landing was unopposed, which came as a relief after all the dire predictions about Japanese resistance, but also felt anticlimactic after weeks of preparation for an assault that never materialized. The Marines hit the beaches expecting fierce fighting and found nothing except a half-finished airfield that Japanese construction workers had abandoned in such haste that breakfast was still sitting on tables in the mess hall. And by afternoon the Marines controlled Henderson Field, the airstrip that would become the key to everything that followed over the next 6 months. But easy landings breed false confidence. The first night shattered that illusion. Japanese bombers appeared after dark. Explosions ripped through Marine positions. Men who'd never been under fire learned terror fast. Carter's squad huddled in a shallow foxhole as bombs walked across the beach. Wilson was crying. O'Brien was praying. Chin stayed silent, face pale in the darkness. Martinez gripped his rifle so hard his knuckles went white. The first night shattered any illusions about this being an easy campaign, as Japanese bombers appeared after dark and dropped their payloads on Marine positions that had no air defense except rifle fire and sheer luck, the explosions tearing through tents and supply dumps while men who had never been under fire learned terror in its purest form. Carter huddled in a shallow foxhole that offered minimal protection, while bombs whistled down and detonated with earth-shaking force that made his teeth rattle and his ears ring, and he wondered if this was how he would die, killed on his first night in combat by an enemy he never even saw. The naval bombardment was worse. Japanese warships crept close under cover of darkness. Opened fire with heavy guns. 14-inch shells screaming overhead. Marines could do nothing but dig deeper and pray. When dawn came, they found devastation. Tents shredded. Equipment destroyed. Several men killed in their sleep. Welcome to Guadalcanal. The naval bombardment was even worse than the bombing, Japanese warships creeping close to shore under cover of darkness and opening fire with their main batteries, 14-inch shells screaming overhead to explode among the Marine positions with devastating effect. Carter pressed himself into the bottom of his foxhole and prayed to a god he wasn't sure he believed in anymore, listening to the shrieks and explosions and screams of wounded men, knowing that there was nothing anyone could do except endure until the ships withdrew or ran out of ammunition, whichever came first. Day 3 brought the first ground attack. Japanese infantry emerged from the jungle at dusk. Maybe 200 soldiers. They came in waves screaming, bayonets fixed. Carter's company held a section of perimeter near the airfield. They had good fields of fire. Machine guns set up. Rifle positions prepared. But nothing prepared them for the ferocity of Japanese assault tactics. When dawn finally came, Carter crawled out of his foxhole to find that the landscape had been transformed during the night, tents shredded by shrapnel, equipment destroyed, several men lying dead in positions that suggested they had been killed instantly without even knowing what hit them. The survivors moved like zombies through the destruction, faces blank with shock as they tried to process what had happened and prepare for whatever might come next. And Carter realized that his squad had just learned in the most brutal way possible that this war was going to be nothing like what they had imagined back in training. The attack hit like a typhoon. Japanese soldiers charging directly into machine gun fire. Many fell, but more kept coming. Some carried satchel charges. Others wielded swords. All were screaming. It was psychological warfare as much as physical. Many young Marines froze. Others fired wildly. Training took over for some. Carter found himself shouting orders, directing fire, keeping his men steady. Day 3 brought the first ground attack, Japanese infantry emerging from the jungle at dusk in waves that came straight at the American lines with bayonets fixed and voices raised in screams that were meant to terrify as much as to coordinate the assault. Carter's company held a section of perimeter near the airfield where they had good fields of fire across open ground, and they opened up with rifles and machine guns that cut down attacking Japanese soldiers and windrows. But more kept coming as if they were immune to fear or simply didn't care whether they lived or died as long as they closed with the American positions. Martinez proved himself a natural fighter. Methodical. Calm under pressure. Picked targets carefully. Made every shot count. Wilson overcame his fear and manned a machine gun position. Held it against 3 separate charges. O'Brien threw grenades with deadly accuracy. Chin stayed quiet but efficient. Reloading magazines. Distributing ammunition. Dragging wounded men to cover. The psychological impact of a Japanese banzai charge was something that no amount of training could prepare you for. The sight of men running directly into machine gun fire without hesitation or even any apparent concern for their own survival. And Carter found himself firing on full automatic until his rifle barrel was too hot to touch. while beside him Martinez was working methodically through target after target with the precision of someone who had completely suppressed his own fear in favor of mechanical efficiency. The attack lasted 2 hours. Felt like days. When the Japanese finally withdrew, the Marine perimeter held. But the cost was brutal. 40 Marines killed. Over 100 wounded. Japanese losses were heavier. Bodies carpeted the killing zone. In the morning light, Carter's men stared at what they'd done. Most had never killed before. Now they'd killed dozens. Some threw up. Others just sat in silence, processing the horror. Wilson surprised everyone by manning a machine gun position after the original gunner was killed, holding the position against 3 separate charges that should have overrun him but didn't because he kept his head and fired in controlled bursts that made every bullet count. Chin moved through the positions distributing ammunition and dragging wounded men to cover, his face expressionless as he went about his duties with a calm that seemed almost supernatural given the chaos and violence erupting all around them. That was just the beginning. Over the following weeks, the pattern repeated. Japanese attacks at night. Naval bombardments. Air raids during the day. Marines held the airfield but little else. Supplied by occasional ship convoys that faced constant enemy interdiction. Food ran short. Medicine ran out. Malaria spread like wildfire through the ranks. The attack lasted 2 hours that felt like days, Japanese soldiers finally withdrawing after suffering horrendous casualties that had gained them nothing except a few dozen meters of ground that they couldn't hold anyway. And when dawn came, Carter and his squad found themselves staring at the aftermath of their first battle, dozens of enemy bodies carpeted across the killing zone. Most of the Marines had never killed anyone before that night, and the sight of what they had done affected them in different ways, some throwing up, others sitting in silence as they tried to process the reality that they had just ended other people's lives and would probably have to do it again many times before this war was over. The jungle itself became an enemy. Dense vegetation. Oppressive heat. Rain that turned everything to mud. Insects everywhere. Mosquitoes carrying malaria and dengue fever. Leeches. Venomous snakes. Crocodiles in the rivers. Men got sick faster than they got wounded. Carter watched his squad shrink from 12 men to 8 to 6. Not from combat. From disease. That was just the beginning of what would become a 6-month nightmare that tested the physical and mental limits of every man who fought on Guadalcanal, a campaign where disease killed more Americans than enemy action, and where survival depended as much on luck and constitution as on military skill. The island itself became an enemy almost as dangerous as the Japanese, the dense jungle providing countless hiding places for snipers and ambush positions, the oppressive heat and humidity sapping strength and energy with every hour that passed, the rain turning everything into knee-deep mud that made movement exhausting and vehicles nearly useless. Wilson caught malaria first. High fever. Chills. Delirium. The medics had no quinine. He lay in a tent, shaking and sweating. Kept fighting anyway when attacks came. Somehow forced himself to his feet, grabbed his rifle, defended his position. Then collapsed afterward. Carter didn't know how he did it. Sheer will. Or maybe fear of letting his buddies down. Malaria spread through the Marine ranks like wildfire, mosquitoes carrying the disease to infect thousands of men who would suffer through cycles of fever and chills that left them weak and disoriented but still expected to fight because there weren't enough healthy men to relieve them. Wilson caught malaria in the second week and spent the next month alternating between periods of lucidity and delirium, but he continued to man his position during Japanese attacks because the alternative was letting down his squad mates, and that was unthinkable even when he could barely stand without support. The Japanese weren't just attacking. They were reinforcing. Ships and submarines brought troops every night. Fast runs down the channel. Marines started calling the slot. Japanese controlled the sea at night. Americans controlled the air during day. But aircraft couldn't stop supply runs in darkness. Every morning brought reports of more enemy troops landed. More equipment. More supplies. The Japanese were building up for something big. Dysentery was almost universal. contaminated water, and poor sanitation, spreading intestinal infections that left men debilitated and unable to keep down food, losing weight at an alarming rate until their uniforms hung on frames that looked skeletal. Martinez went from a solid 180 pounds to less than 130 over the course of 3 months, his face gaunt and his eyes sunken, but he never complained and never asked to be relieved because Marines don't quit, and he would rather have died than admitted he couldn't continue. Henderson Field became operational in late August. Marine and Navy pilots flying from the captured airstrip. Wildcats and Dauntless. They attacked Japanese ships, bombed enemy positions, provided close air support. It made a difference. But not enough. The ground situation remained desperate. Marines held a shrinking perimeter, surrounded by jungle full of Japanese troops, supplied by the bare minimum, watching friends die of disease and combat. The Japanese Navy controlled the waters around Guadalcanal during nighttime, which meant that supplies could only be brought in during daylight hours when American air cover was available, and even then the convoys were subject to air attack and submarine interdiction that made resupply uncertain and irregular. Food became scarce enough that meals were reduced to 1 per day, usually rice and captured Japanese rations that nobody liked but everyone ate because the alternative was starvation, and Carter watched his men grow thinner and weaker while still being expected to patrol and fight and maintain the defensive perimeter that was all that stood between Henderson Field and Japanese forces that were constantly probing for weaknesses. September brought a major Japanese offensive. General Kawaguchi landed 6,000 fresh troops. Planned a coordinated attack from multiple directions. Intelligence warned the Marines. They prepared as best they could. Reinforced key positions. Stockpiled ammunition. Waited for the storm. October 15th marked one of the darkest days of Carter's life when Private Eddie O'Brien from Boston was killed during a Japanese probe of their sector, a single artillery shell landing directly in the foxhole where O'Brien had been sleeping, the explosion so violent that there was nothing left to bury except scattered pieces that had to be collected in a poncho. O'Brien had been one of the original members of the squad, a good kid with an infectious laugh who had kept spirits up during the worst times, and his death hit the survivors hard because it could just as easily have been any of them, the arbitrary nature of combat death making it impossible to feel safe anywhere at any time. It came on September 12th. Night attack from the south. Kawaguchi's men hit a ridge held by Marine raiders and paratroopers. The fighting was savage. Hand-to-hand combat in darkness. Japanese broke through in several places. Marines counterattacked. Pushed them back. The battle raged all night. Both sides taking horrific casualties. But the Marines held. The battle for Henderson Field reached its climax in late October when the Japanese launched their most determined offensive yet, coordinating naval bombardment with ground assault and air attack in an effort to overwhelm the defenders through sheer weight of firepower and numbers. Carter's company found itself defending a critical section of perimeter where a breakthrough would have allowed Japanese forces direct access to the airfield, and they held their positions through 2 days of continuous combat that saw them running low on ammunition and water while the enemy kept coming in waves that seemed endless. Carter's company wasn't in the main fight. They held the western perimeter. Faced probing attacks. Harassment fire. The real battle was a mile away. They could hear it. Machine guns. Grenades. Screaming. Flares lighting the sky. Men dying in the jungle darkness. They wanted to help but couldn't leave their positions. Had to trust other Marines to hold. Martinez was hit during the second day of fighting, a bullet punching through his thigh and dropping him in the bottom of his foxhole, but he refused evacuation and continued to fire his rifle one-handed while using his other hand to apply pressure to the wound that was bleeding so much it seemed impossible he could survive. Carter crawled over to him under heavy fire and bandaged the wound as best he could with supplies from his medical kit, but Martinez needed a doctor, and there was no way to get him to one until the attack was over, so all Carter could do was promise to keep him alive and hope that promise wasn't a lie. By morning, the Japanese were retreating. Kawaguchi had gambled everything on breaking through. Failed. Lost 1,500 men. The Marines lost about 200. A tactical victory. But the strategic situation remained precarious. More Japanese would come. Always more. The Japanese attack finally broke after American artillery and naval gunfire decimated their assault formations, the survivors withdrawing into the jungle to lick their wounds and prepare for the next attempt. Martinez survived his wound but was evacuated the next day when infection set in despite the sulfa drugs that the medics had used to prevent it, and Carter watched him being carried to the aid station knowing he would probably never see him again, the bond between them formed by months of shared hardship being severed in an instant by the random violence of war. October was hell. Both sides battered and exhausted. Disease rampant. Supplies critically low. Marines nicknamed the island Starvation Island. They weren't joking. Food reduced to 1 meal a day. Sometimes less. Men lost dramatic weight. Looked like skeletons. But they kept fighting. Kept holding. Because surrendering wasn't an option. Japan took no prisoners. Everyone knew what happened to Marines who surrendered. Better to die fighting. By November, the situation on Guadalcanal had stabilized enough that reinforcements could be landed and casualties evacuated, American naval victories having broken Japanese control of the surrounding waters and allowing regular supply convoys to reach the island. Carter's squad, now down to 5 men from the original 8, was rotated off the line for a few days of rest that consisted mainly of eating hot meals and sleeping without having to worry about being attacked. Simple pleasures that felt like luxury after months of living in constant danger. Martinez got dysentery. Brutal. Constant. He was literally wasting away. Carter watched him shrink from a muscular athlete to a gaunt shadow. But Martinez refused evacuation. Wouldn't leave his squad. Kept fighting even when he could barely stand. That was the spirit on Guadalcanal. Men pushed beyond human limits because their buddies depended on them. The fighting continued through December and into January of 1943, the Japanese gradually being pushed back from Henderson Field and eventually withdrawing from the island entirely in early February after suffering over 20,000 casualties while accomplishing nothing except to delay the American advance by a few months. Carter and what remained of his squad were evacuated to Australia in mid-February, their part in the Guadalcanal campaign finally over after 6 months of combat and disease that had reduced the 1st Marine Division to a shadow of its former strength. O'Brien was killed on October 15. Japanese patrol infiltrated Marine lines before dawn. Crept up to positions. Started throwing grenades. O'Brien's foxhole took a direct hit. He died instantly. Wilson and Chin were in the next hole. Unhurt physically. Broken inside. O'Brien had been their friend since boot camp. They'd promised to all go home together. Now that promise was broken. The statistics from Guadalcanal told a story of human cost that numbers alone couldn't convey. Over 1,600 Americans killed in action and another 4,000 wounded, but more than 8,000 evacuated due to disease, the tropical environment proving almost as deadly as enemy action. Carter himself had lost 40 pounds and contracted both malaria and dysentery. His body so weakened that it took months of rest and treatment before he was fit for duty again, and even then he never fully recovered the physical health he had enjoyed before setting foot on that island. The funeral was brief. No time for ceremony. Wrap the body. Say a prayer. Bury it in a shallow grave marked with a rifle and helmet. Carter said words over O'Brien. Talked about his courage. His friendship. His sacrifice. But words felt hollow. O'Brien was 20 years old. Would never go home. Never see his family. Never live the life he planned. Just another casualty in a jungle nightmare. The psychological damage was harder to quantify but no less real, Carter finding himself unable to sleep without nightmares about Japanese attacks and screaming wounded men, jumping at sudden noises and feeling a constant low-level anxiety that never entirely went away even when he was in safe locations far from any combat. The doctors called it combat fatigue and said it would get better with time, but Carter wasn't so sure because the memories were too vivid and the losses too personal for time to heal completely. Late October brought naval battles. American and Japanese fleets clashing at night in the waters off Guadalcanal. The Marines could see it from shore. Flashes of gunfire. Explosions. Ships burning. Sometimes debris and bodies washed up on the beaches. Grim reminders that the Navy was fighting as hard as the ground troops, taking casualties trying to keep supplies flowing. Wilson made it through the entire campaign despite his malaria, his skinny frame somehow enduring hardships that broke bigger and stronger men, but the experience changed him in ways that were obvious to anyone who knew him before Guadalcanal. The eager young private who had boarded the transport ship in August had become a hard-eyed veteran by February, his innocence burned away by months of combat, and disease and death, and when people asked him about the campaign he would just shake his head and change the subject because there were no words that could explain what it had been like to people who hadn't experienced it themselves. November brought the final crisis. Japanese committed major reinforcements. Battleships. Cruisers. Transports full of troops. They were going all in, determined to retake Henderson Field. American intelligence detected the buildup, moved in additional Marine and Army units, set up for the decisive battle. Shin survived as well, his steady competence and unflappable demeanor having made him invaluable during the worst moments of the campaign, and Carter recommended him for promotion to corporal based on his performance under fire. The recommendation was approved, and Chen went on to serve in subsequent campaigns across the Pacific, eventually earning a Silver Star for heroism on Okinawa, where he would be killed 3 days before the war ended, his death coming so close to final victory that it seemed particularly cruel even by the harsh standards of combat where death was always arbitrary and meaningless. It came mid-month. Multiple Japanese attacks from different directions. The largest hit the Mataniko River sector. Thousands of Japanese troops supported by tanks. They broke through in places, overran some positions. Marines counterattacked. Fighting swayed back and forth. Machine guns firing until barrels glowed red. Artillery firing over open sights. Men fighting with rifles, grenades, knives, bare hands. Carter himself was assigned to training duties after recovering from Guadalcanal, his combat experience deemed too valuable to risk in further fighting when he could be used to train replacement troops heading to the Pacific. He spent the rest of the war at Camp Pendleton teaching young Marines the lessons he had learned the hard way on Guadalcanal, trying to prepare them for the reality of jungle warfare and tropical disease and night attacks that came out of nowhere. Knowing that his words alone couldn't truly prepare them for what they would face, but hoping that at least some of what he taught might help keep them alive. Carter's company was thrown into the breach. Rushed forward to plug a gap in the line. They arrived at dawn. Found chaos. Wounded Marines everywhere. Dead Japanese scattered across the battlefield. Burning tanks. The smell of death and cordite. They took positions and prepared for the next assault. He was discharged in November of 1945 and returned to his home in Missouri, where he eventually found work as a factory foreman and married a woman who understood that some of his experiences were too painful to discuss and didn't press him for details about his time in the Pacific. They raised 3 children who grew up knowing their father had fought in World War II but never really understanding what that meant because Carter rarely spoke about it except on rare occasions when he would meet with other Guadalcanal veterans and they would share memories that outsiders couldn't comprehend. It came an hour later. Japanese infantry charging across open ground. Carter's men opened fire. Dropped dozens. More kept coming. Wave after wave. Relentless. Fearless. Some got close enough to throw grenades. Martinez picked them off with precise rifle fire. Wilson's machine gun cut down entire squads. Chin distributed ammunition while Carter directed their fire. William Carter passed away in 1995 at the age of 79, his death certificate listing heart disease as the cause, but his family knowing that the real cause was everything he had endured on Guadalcanal more than 50 years earlier. The physical and psychological toll of that campaign having shortened his life even though he survived long enough to see his grandchildren grow up. His funeral was attended by 2 other Guadalcanal survivors who stood in the rain to salute his casket, old men remembering young men they had been together in a place that had tested them beyond anything they thought they could endure, and finding that they had somehow survived when so many others had not. A Japanese soldier made it to their position. Jumped into the foxhole with a bayonet. Carter met him with his entrenching tool. Brutal close-quarters fight. Carter killed him but took a bayonet slash across his ribs. Not deep. Painful. Chin bandaged it while the fight raged around them. No time to process what had happened. Just keep fighting. The attack broke by mid-morning. Japanese withdrew, leaving hundreds of dead. Marine casualties were heavy too. Carter's company started the day with 90 men. Ended with 62. 28 killed or wounded in 3 hours. The mathematics of war. Brutal. Unforgiving. But the Japanese offensive had failed. Their logistics couldn't sustain the effort. American air and naval power had sunk too many supply ships. The troops on Guadalcanal were starving too. Worse than the Marines. They started withdrawing in December. Not openly. Quietly. At night. Slipping away into the jungle. Evacuating by submarine and destroyer. The Marines pursued cautiously. Expecting ambushes. Finding abandoned positions. Dead Japanese who'd been too sick or wounded to evacuate. By February 1943, the island was secured. 6 months of hell had ended. America's first offensive victory. Proved the Japanese weren't invincible. Showed Marines could take and hold ground. But the cost was staggering. Carter's battalion landed with 1,200 men. 300 were killed. 600 wounded or medically evacuated. Only 300 remained combat effective. Similar ratios across the division. The human cost of victory was immense. Every survivor carried physical and psychological scars. Martinez was evacuated in January. Dysentery had nearly killed him. He weighed 90 pounds. Could barely walk. But he'd survived. Carter visited him before the hospital ship left. Martinez gripped his hand weakly. "Thanks for keeping us alive, Sarge." Carter didn't know what to say. He'd lost O'Brien. Lost others. Hadn't kept everyone alive. But he nodded. "You did good, Marine. Real good." Wilson and Chin both survived. Promoted to corporal. Given their own squads. They'd proven themselves in the crucible. Young men forced to become hardened warriors. They'd never be the same. None of them would. Guadalcanal changed everyone who fought there. Left marks that would never fully heal. The division was pulled back to Australia. Rest and refit. Replace casualties. Integrate new replacements. Carter looked at the fresh-faced kids arriving. Reminded him of himself 6 months ago. Before Guadalcanal. Before he learned what war really meant. These kids would learn too. The hard way. In jungles and islands across the Pacific. He tried to prepare them. Told them about disease. About jungle fighting. About Japanese tactics. But words couldn't convey the reality. They'd have to experience it themselves. Learn or die. That was the brutal truth of Pacific War infantry combat. No middle ground. You adapted or you died. Carter stayed in the Marines. Fought through the rest of the war. Tarawa. Saipan. Okinawa. Each battle was hell. Each took pieces of him. But Guadalcanal remained the worst in his memory. 6 months of unrelenting misery. Disease. Starvation. Constant combat. Fighting an enemy who never quit. Holding positions with sick and exhausted men. Watching friends die of malaria and bullets. After the war, Carter returned to his hometown in Pennsylvania. Tried to resume normal life. Got a job. Got married. Had children. But part of him remained on that jungle island. In foxholes under mortar fire. Watching O'Brien die. Holding the perimeter with starving, sick men who refused to surrender. The memories never left. He attended reunions with other Guadalcanal veterans. They didn't talk much about the fighting. Just sat together. Shared silence. Understanding without words. They'd been through something few could comprehend. A campaign fought under the worst possible conditions. Against a determined enemy. With minimal support. And they'd won. Martinez recovered. Gained the weight back. Returned to Los Angeles. Became a police officer. Married his high school sweetheart. They stayed in touch. Letters at first. Then phone calls. Eventually visits. The bond forged in combat never broke. They'd depended on each other for survival. That created connections deeper than family. Wilson struggled after the war. Nightmares. Flashbacks. What they'd later call post-traumatic stress disorder. He drank heavily. Couldn't hold jobs. His family didn't understand. How could they? They hadn't been there. Hadn't seen what he'd seen. Done what he'd done. Carter tried to help. Got him into veterans programs. Stayed in contact. But some wounds couldn't heal. Chin returned to San Francisco. His family had been interned during the war. Lost everything. The irony was bitter. He'd fought for America while America imprisoned his family. But he didn't become bitter. Found work. Helped rebuild the community. Married. Raised kids. Taught them about service and sacrifice. About doing your duty even when it's unfair. The legacy of Guadalcanal extended beyond individual stories. It proved amphibious operations could succeed. Showed combined arms coordination worked. Demonstrated American forces could fight and win in the Pacific. But most importantly, it showed ordinary men could do extraordinary things under impossible conditions. The Marines who fought there weren't superheroes. They were regular Americans. Farmers, mechanics, students, workers. Thrust into a nightmare and forced to adapt. Many broke. Some died. But enough held. Enough kept fighting. Enough refused to quit. That made the difference between victory and defeat. Carter thought about that often in his later years. What made men keep fighting when everything was against them? When they were starving, sick, exhausted, surrounded? Some said it was training. Others claimed patriotism. But Carter knew the truth. Men fought for each other. For the Marine next to them in the foxhole. For their squad. Their platoon. Their buddies. That bond was stronger than fear. Stronger than hunger. Stronger than death. He spoke at schools sometimes. Told young people about Guadalcanal. Not glorifying war. Explaining its reality. The horror. The waste. The necessity. He wanted them to understand what previous generations had sacrificed. What freedom cost. What duty meant. The lessons learned in jungles 70 years ago remained relevant. In 2008, Carter returned to Guadalcanal. A veteran's tour. He was 92 years old. Walking with difficulty. Memory fading. But when he stepped on that beach, everything came back. Henderson Field still there, now an airport. The jungle reclaimed most battlefield sites. But the memories remained crystal clear. He visited O'Brien's grave. One of thousands in the military cemetery. Stood there crying. First time he'd cried about it in decades. O'Brien had been 20. Never got to live. Never got to love, marry, have children. Died in a jungle for an island most Americans couldn't find on a map. But his sacrifice mattered. It all mattered. William Carter passed away in 2012 at age 96. His obituary mentioned Guadalcanal. His medals. His service. But couldn't capture the full story. The boy from Pennsylvania who became a man in hell. Who kept his Marines alive through 6 months of horror. Who carried those memories until his last breath. At his funeral, Martinez spoke. Now 88 himself. Talked about Carter's leadership. His courage. His humanity in the midst of inhumanity. How he'd saved their lives repeatedly. How he'd held them together when everything was falling apart. How he'd been the best Marine any of them ever served with. The Battle of Guadalcanal lasted from August 1942 to February 1943. 6 months that changed the Pacific War. 7,000 Americans killed. Over 30,000 Japanese dead. The first step in a long campaign that would eventually reach Tokyo Bay. Every island after Guadalcanal was built on lessons learned there. But for those who fought on that jungle island, it was more personal. It was O'Brien dying in a foxhole. Martinez wasting away from disease. Wilson manning a machine gun while delirious with fever. Chin quietly doing his job under fire. Carter trying to keep them all alive. Individual stories that together created history. The lessons remain. War is horror, but sometimes necessary. Freedom requires sacrifice, often from those least able to afford it. Young men and women who answer the call, do their duty, fight for each other. Some come home. Some don't. All are changed forever. We honor them by remembering, by telling their stories, by ensuring their sacrifice meant something. Guadalcanal proved America could win, showed Marines could take ground and hold it, demonstrated Japanese forces could be beaten. But most importantly, it revealed what ordinary Americans were capable of when tested. When pushed beyond normal human limits. When forced to choose between surrender and death. They chose to fight. To hold. To win. That spirit lives on. In every generation. Americans who stepped forward when called. Who served despite the cost. Who sacrificed for something larger than themselves. The legacy of Guadalcanal. The legacy of Carter and Martinez and Wilson and Chin and O'Brien. The legacy of every Marine who fought in that jungle. That legacy is eternal. That sacrifice is never forgotten. The dense jungle has reclaimed most of the battlefield. Nature healed what war destroyed. But the memories remain. In history books. In museums. In the minds of survivors and their families. In the American character. The knowledge that when tested, we didn't break. We didn't surrender. We fought. We held. We won. That's the story of Guadalcanal. That's what we must never forget. The daily reality of Guadalcanal went beyond major battles. It was the grinding horror of simply existing in that environment. Marines lived in constant wetness. Rain fell almost daily. Everything was perpetually damp. Uniforms rotted off bodies. Boots fell apart. Equipment rusted. Fungal infections covered skin. Rot consumed everything. The food situation was desperate. Sea rations when available. Often just captured Japanese rice. Sometimes nothing for days. Men hunted in the jungle. Killed snakes and lizards. Ate anything that wouldn't kill them. Some got sick from bad water. Dysentery was universal. Everyone had it to some degree. The question was how bad. Carter watched his men deteriorate physically. Martinez lost 50 pounds. Wilson developed jungle rot so bad his feet were covered in open sores. Chin got malaria 3 times. Each time worse than the last. The quinine was gone by September. After that, men just suffered through it. Shaking with fever while still manning positions. Delirious but still fighting when attacks came. The Japanese suffered worse. Their supply situation was catastrophic. Ships couldn't get through American air power during the day. Night runs weren't enough. Japanese troops were literally starving. Americans found dead enemy soldiers who died from malnutrition. Others were so weak they could barely fight. But they fought anyway. That was the horror. Both sides pushing men beyond survival limits. Sleep became a luxury. Marines could never fully relax. Japanese infiltrated at night. Sometimes alone. Sometimes in small groups. They'd creep close to foxholes. Throw grenades. Stab sleeping men. Every Marine learned to sleep lightly. Wake at any sound. Trust your watch partner with your life. Because he literally held it. Carter developed a routine to keep his squad functioning. Forced them to eat even when they had no appetite. Made them clean weapons daily despite the humidity. Checked their feet for jungle rot. Inspected them for early signs of disease. Leadership in that environment meant being part medic, part psychologist, part drill sergeant. Keeping men combat effective when everything conspired against it. The psychological strain was immense. Being surrounded. Outnumbered. Cut off. Sick. Hungry. Under constant attack. It broke some men. Combat fatigue they called it then. What we now know as PTSD. Men who just shut down. Stopped functioning. Had to be evacuated. No shame in it. Every human has a breaking point. Guadalcanal found many. Carter nearly broke in October. During the worst of it. 3 straight days of attacks. No sleep. Barely any food. Half his men sick with malaria. O'Brien just killed. He found himself shaking uncontrollably. Couldn't stop. Couldn't focus. Martinez took over. Gave Carter orders. Made him rest. Role reversal that probably saved Carter's sanity. Even leaders need leadership sometimes. The nights were worst. Darkness absolute under the jungle canopy. Every sound potentially hostile. Every shadow a threat. Flares went up constantly, illuminating landscapes that looked alien, like fighting on another planet. Trees draped with vines. Strange plants everywhere. The whole environment hostile to human life. Japanese psychological warfare added to the horror. They'd call out in English. Try to make Marines reveal positions. Sometimes they'd play recordings. American music. Women's voices. Trying to demoralize defenders. Make them homesick. Make them careless. Most Marines learned to ignore it. But it wore on you. Constant psychological pressure on top of physical danger. The Marine defenders weren't all American-born. Men like Chen faced additional challenges. Japanese Americans fighting against Japan while their families were interned at home. The irony was bitter. The injustice clear. But Chen never complained. Never questioned his duty. Fought as hard as anyone. Maybe harder. Proving his loyalty every day in ways that shouldn't have been necessary. African American Marines served in support roles. Unloading ships. Moving supplies. Fixing equipment. Segregation was still military policy. But on Guadalcanal, bullets didn't discriminate. Support troops came under fire regularly. Showed the same courage as infantry. Carter worked with ammunition carriers who risked their lives bringing forward supplies under Japanese fire. Heroes who never get credit because of their skin color. The Navy offshore fought battles just as desperate. Trying to control the seas around Guadalcanal. Multiple major naval engagements. Ships sunk on both sides. Sailors dying in burning vessels or shark-infested waters. Every supply run was a battle. Every reinforcement convoy risked destruction. The Marines on shore depended on the Navy. And the Navy delivered despite horrific losses. Pilots from Henderson Field flew multiple missions daily. Attacking Japanese ships. Bombing troop concentrations. Providing close air support. They were outnumbered. Often outgunned. But they controlled the daytime sky. That made the difference between victory and defeat. Many died in flames. Many crashed in the jungle. Some walked out. Some didn't. But they kept flying. The coast watchers deserve special mention. Australians and natives hidden on nearby islands. They radioed warnings of Japanese air raids. Gave Marines precious minutes to scramble fighters and take cover. Those warnings saved countless lives. The coast watchers operated behind enemy lines. In constant danger. Many were captured and executed. But their contribution was incalculable. Native Solomon Islanders helped immensely. Guided patrols through the jungle. Rescued downed pilots. Provided intelligence on Japanese movements. Often at great risk. The Japanese were brutal to natives suspected of helping Americans. Entire villages massacred. But many islanders continued helping. Their bravery is often forgotten. But Marines remembered. Owed their lives to native guides and scouts. The corpsmen and medics were miracle workers. Operating under impossible conditions. No proper facilities. Limited supplies. They performed surgery in tents during air raids. Treated hundreds of casualties with minimal equipment. Worked until they collapsed. Then got up and worked more. Many were killed trying to reach wounded Marines. They went anyway. Because that was their duty. Religion became important to many. Atheists found God in foxholes. Believers prayed constantly. Chaplains moved among the positions. held services, gave comfort. Some were killed. Father O'Callaghan became famous for his bravery under fire. But there were dozens of chaplains, ministers, priests, rabbis, all risking their lives to minister to Marines who needed spiritual support as much as material. Mail call was sacred. Letters from home were treasures. Read and reread until they fell apart. News from the world. Reminders that civilization still existed. That there was something beyond this jungle hell. Women they loved. Families who waited. Lives to return to. If they survived. That if hung over everything. But letters provided hope. Maintained the connection to home. Carter wrote to his mother weekly. When he could. Told her he was fine. Eating well. Safe. All lies. But necessary. No point worrying her. Couldn't explain the reality anyway. How do you describe living in a foxhole full of water? Eating rotten rice? Watching men die from infected wounds because there's no medicine? You don't. You write that you're fine and hope she believes it. The inter-service rivalries added dark humor. Marines versus Army. Navy versus everyone. Each branch claiming superiority. Mocking the others. But when bullets flew, branches didn't matter. When Marines needed help, Army units supported them. When soldiers were in trouble, Marines assisted. The rivalry was real but shallow. The brotherhood of combat ran deeper. Equipment failures were constant. Rifles jammed from rust and mud. Radios failed in humidity. Vehicles broke down on coral roads. Mortars misfired. Everything mechanical struggled in that environment. Marines learned improvisation. Field expedient repairs. Making do with whatever worked. Duct tape and determination. Combat engineering at its most basic. Japanese equipment had the same problems. Their rifles worked better in the wet. Their optics were superior. But their logistics were worse. They couldn't keep heavy weapons supplied. Couldn't maintain vehicles. Couldn't feed troops. Technical advantages meant nothing without logistical support. Americans eventually won because they could sustain operations. Not because they fought better. The Battle of Henderson Field was symbolic. An airstrip representing control of the island. Of the sea. Of the campaign. Both sides poured resources into its control. Died by thousands for a strip of bulldozed coral. Future historians might question if it was worth it. But strategically it was crucial. Whoever held Henderson controlled the Solomons. Controlled the path to Japan. The Tokyo Express became legendary. Japanese destroyer runs at night. Racing down the slot. Delivering troops and supplies. Bombarding Marine positions. Then racing back before dawn brought American aircraft. High speed. High risk. Some made it. Some were sunk. But they kept coming. Japanese Navy showing the same determination as their infantry. Never quit. Never surrender. American submarines played a crucial role. Interdicting Japanese supply lines. Sinking transports. Attacking warships. Silent service operating in enemy-controlled waters. Taking casualties rarely reported. But their contribution was enormous. Every Japanese ship sunk with supplies not reaching Guadalcanal. Troops not arriving. Equipment not delivered. Submarines won battles from beneath the waves. The Cactus Air Force became famous. Nicknamed for Henderson Field's aircraft. Marine, Navy, and Army pilots flying together. Whatever worked. Whatever flew. Wildcats, Dauntless, Iracabras, flying fortresses. Mechanics keeping planes flying with salvaged parts. Pilots flying missions beyond exhaustion. Ground crew working through air raids. Everyone doing impossible work because the alternative was defeat. The battles in Iron Bottom Sound were horrifying. Naval clashes at night. Point-blank range. Ships ramming each other. Sailors fighting in darkness. So many vessels sunk the Sound was named for the iron resting on its bottom. American sailors proved as tough as Marines. Took terrible losses. Kept coming back. Kept fighting. kept delivering supplies and reinforcements. The Matanako River became a battlefield repeatedly. Japanese attacked across it. Americans defended. Changed hands multiple times. Men fought and died for a muddy stream that looked insignificant. But it anchored the Marine defensive line. Had to be held. Was held. At great cost. Measured in lives and suffering. Edson's Ridge was another critical point. Named for Colonel Merritt Edson. His raiders held it against massive Japanese assault in September. Desperate close-range fighting. Ridge changing hands repeatedly. Finally held by raiders who refused to break. That stand saved Henderson Field. Saved the campaign. Edson received the Medal of Honor. But every raider on that ridge deserved it. The Tenru River battle showed Japanese tactical limitations. Frontal assault across a sandbar. Directly into machine guns. Hundreds killed. The attack failed completely. Japanese proving their courage but also their inflexibility. Unwilling to adapt. Committing to plans even when those plans clearly failed. That inflexibility cost them dearly throughout the war. Artillery became crucial as campaign progressed. American guns outranged Japanese. Could deliver sustained fire. Japanese guns were better hidden. More mobile. But couldn't match American firepower. Artillery duels at night. Counter-battery fire. Forward observers calling strikes. The big guns often made the difference between successful defense and being overrun. Tank battles were rare but dramatic. Marines had a few light tanks. Japanese brought some too. Neither were ideal for jungle terrain. But they fought anyway. At Matanako. At the Point Cruz area. Small numbers. Close range. Sometimes tanks dueling other tanks. Sometimes fighting infantry. Neither side used armor effectively. But they tried. Communication was primitive by modern standards. Radio unreliable. Field telephones when wire could be strung. Often messages went by runner. Men sprinting between positions under fire. Carrying orders. Bringing reports. Dangerous work. Essential work. Many runners were killed. But without them, coordination was impossible. They were the nervous system of the battlefield. Intelligence gathering was crucial and difficult. Captured documents. Prisoner interrogations. Aerial reconnaissance. Coast Watcher reports. Piecing together Japanese intentions. Strength. Movements. Good intelligence saved lives. Bad intelligence cost them. The intelligence war was fought as hard as the shooting war. Less visible but equally important. Disease statistics were staggering. By November, half of all Marines had malaria. Nearly everyone had dysentery. Fungal infections were universal. Some men had all three plus other tropical diseases. Medical evacuations exceeded combat casualties. The jungle was killing more effectively than bullets. That shaped tactics. Strategy. Everything. Disease was a strategic factor. Reinforcements arrived gradually. New units. Individual replacements. They looked healthy. Well-fed. Shocked when they saw veteran Marines. Skeletal. Diseased. Exhausted. But still fighting. The contrast was stark. Green troops had no idea what they were entering. Veterans couldn't explain. The gulf between the experienced and inexperienced was immense. Training proved inadequate for jungle warfare. No one knew how to fight there. Marines learned on the job. Costly lessons. Mistakes paid for in blood. But they learned. Adapted. Developed tactics. By the end, American jungle fighting techniques were effective. But that knowledge came at terrible price. Every lesson learned cost lives. Rotation wasn't really possible. Too few units. Too much frontage to cover. Men stayed on line for months. Beyond human endurance. But they endured anyway. Because they had no choice. Because quitting meant everyone died. So they kept going. Kept fighting. Kept somehow surviving when survival seemed impossible. The final Japanese withdrawal was almost anticlimactic. After 6 months of brutal combat, they just left. Evacuated by ship at night. Slipped away. Marines pursued, but the jungles swallowed retreating troops. Some Japanese stayed behind. Died in the jungle. Others made it to evacuation points. The campaign just ended. No dramatic final battle. Just exhaustion and relief. The accounting afterward was grim. 7,000 Americans dead. 30,000 Japanese. Countless natives. Ships sunk. Aircraft destroyed. Resources expended. All for one jungle island. But it mattered. First American offensive victory. Proved Japanese could be beaten. Gave hope. Showed the way forward. Every Pacific island after was possible because of Guadalcanal. Carter never forgot the lessons. Leadership meant caring for your men. Keeping them fed, healthy, combat effective. Setting example. Sharing danger. Never asking them to do anything you wouldn't. Those lessons applied beyond combat. Applied to life. He tried to live by them. Tried to pass them forward. Martinez became a police officer because of Guadalcanal. Learned he could stay calm in crisis. Could lead. Could make hard decisions. Those skills served him well in law enforcement. He credited the Marines. Credited Carter. Credited the crucible of combat for teaching him who he was. What he could do. Wilson's struggles were also Guadalcanal's legacy. The war broke something in him. Some part that never healed. The nightmares. The flashbacks. The inability to adjust to peace. Many veterans suffered similarly. Society didn't understand. Called them weak. They weren't weak. They'd been pushed beyond human limits. Some broke. That wasn't weakness. That was humanity. Chen's story inspired his children. Fighting for America while America imprisoned his family. That sacrifice. That loyalty despite injustice. His kids grew up knowing their father was a hero. Knowing he'd fought for principles even when those principles were denied to him. That legacy shaped generations. The memory of Guadalcanal shaped post-war America. Veterans came home knowing they could overcome anything. Had survived the unsurvivable. That confidence. That resilience. That determination. It built the prosperity of the 50s and 60s. The men who'd held Guadalcanal could hold anything. Could build anything. And they did. The Marines who fought there created the modern Corps. The tactics. The culture. The spirit. Guadalcanal forged the legend. Every Marine since walks in those shadows. Lives up to that standard. The legacy is eternal. The sacrifice unforgotten. The lesson clear. Americans don't quit. Don't surrender. Fight. Hold. Win. That's what Carter wanted remembered. Not glorifying war. Understanding its cost. But also its necessity. Evil exists. Must be opposed. Sometimes opposition requires sacrifice. Requires young men to suffer and die in jungles far from home. We honor them by remembering. By learning. By ensuring their sacrifice meant something. By being worthy of their legacy. William Carter. Jack Martinez. Tommy Wilson. Joe Chin. Eddie O'Brien. And thousands more. Names in history books. But they were real people. With hopes and fears. Families they loved. Lives they wanted to live. They gave all that up. Not for glory. Not for medals. For each other. For duty. For country. That sacrifice demands remembrance. Demands we never forget. Demands we remain worthy of what they gave us.